Hi, I'm Max, currently lead the DevRel project in Nym, the mixnet project, and most of my work is focusing on developer experience and working on our SDKs, so trying to make privacy as accessible as possible for application and library developers.
So, Max, for those who don't know you,
Yes.
you share a bit of your background, like how did you end up like doing what you're doing now? Like a bit of your personal story, mix like maybe from activism and professional layer.
Absolutely. So, my academic background is actually in philosophy. So I basically got into kind of like crypto and kind of like, I suppose technology to, I suppose you could call it like this kind of like liberatory or like emancipatory technology kind of like movement in general. I got into that when I was actually like studying in the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. So I was there, and the Netherlands, especially kind of through the kind of music and cultural scene of Amsterdam, still has there's still kind of like the remnants of like the previously very strong kind of like free spaces and like squatting scene, basically. And so I was kind of culturally kind of like, spending time in spaces like that, going to gigs. I had kind of like friends who were like involved in this scene whilst studying a lot of political philosophy. And then at the same time kind of heard about Bitcoin and tried to, I suppose then, like saw that there was like, oh, okay, this is really interesting. You have like this idea of like maybe like a non-state or a more like autonomous conception of like money and value. And especially when, spaces like this, they can struggle because, maybe like banks don't like them or their PayPal account gets shut down, and especially in the context of cash becoming far less of the way that people are actually like moving value around, right? Which has kind of happening all over the world, like especially in like certain parts of Western Europe, like the Netherlands, like it's increasingly becoming like very, very cashless, and they were kind of like leading the way in that. So that was, I suppose, my entry point from this mixture of like, political philosophy, at the time reading a lot of like Foucault and kind of like post-Marxist philosophy and stuff, and this like very concrete example. And really then kind of got into crypto almost a lot through the art scene, actually. So a lot through the like early crypto art scene. So I was part of a project called TerraZero for quite a long time, which was basically a project that was this, when we published the paper, we published the kind of this kind of white paper, like playing with the white paper form as well, right? This was the time, 2016, like you just have white papers kind of like coming out left and right, these kind of like utopian visions that people were building in white papers. And we kind of published this white paper of essentially like a forest that was able to own itself and manage itself, right? Using a kind of structure that like now you would call a DAO, right? So it was somewhat of a provocation, basically, of like, okay, well, like, how can you actually push the idea of having this kind of like autonomous smart contract managed system kind of to the nth degree, but also then trying to use it in a way that was, how do you actually allow a space to almost like protect itself from people, right? So it was written in the context of this kind of like 3-generation cycle that's particularly prevalent in Germany. The other two guys, Paul Seidler and Paul Colling, who started the project before I joined it, and then it was the three of us working on it for quite a few years. They're both based in Berlin, and it was like really this, there's this cycle that exists of people inherit land, there's forest on it, they don't really know what to do with it, and inevitably it gets logged and kind of turned into like a monoculture, right? Which is like just like ecologically disastrous, basically. So how do you kind of how could you, using kind of cryptocurrency and smart contracts, like allow a forest to essentially like own and manage itself in a way that actually makes sense from that perspective, mm-hmm. and also like kind of taking it out of the loop from having people kind of own and manage it, but not taking it out of the financial loop itself, right? Which is I suppose just, looking at the reality of the fact that almost everything is kind of embedded within this kind of system of value, right? And you couldn't just kind of take it out and leave it, because that's also not how it would work. Kind of really my background is also in noise music and the kind of cultural side of stuff. And then, a couple of years ago, I started working for NIM, and really, it's working on network level privacy stuff seemed at the time, and still is, very urgent. This feels like the moment that it can be done. And, obviously the hackathon you're doing now, and a lot of people share that sentiment, but it does, it does very much feel like, okay, this is the point that this stuff needs to get made. Otherwise, maybe it won't. I've been doing that for almost 4 years at this point, leading the DevRel team, and increasingly recently, focusing on actually developing integrations, but also, trying to work on our SDKs and make something as, I suppose, almost esoteric as a mixnet, as approachable and usable for developers as possible, right? I think you see this in you see this kind of all across the entire, I suppose, almost the OSI stack of privacy, depending on what people are working on. And that's still very much the kind of pain point for developers to actually adopt this into their own tools, right? It's how different from the existing stuff is that? And that's really because kind of in the same way that with TerraZero, you're not trying to pull this piece of land outside of the kind of value flows that currently exist, because that doesn't really work. You also, I think, need to be focusing on stuff like developer experience, because it's not because people are uninterested or they see something complicated and they go, oh, I don't want to do that. It's because of the reality, I think, of how people are building, right? Which usually, if you're building a weekend project, you don't necessarily have time to okay, cool, I'm going to spend 3 weeks kind of rejigging how I think of network traffic moving around, because you just simply don't really have time, right? So that's kind of one of my main focus at NIM at the moment, is trying to allow for the use of the mixnet to be kind of as seamless as possible, basically. Yeah.
Oh, really cool to it.
Thank you.
So I wanted to discuss it more in the end, but you've mentioned that, and I like the word about the urgency of privacy. The exact word, and I think it's very Punkt, as they would say in German. So why do you think it's urgent? I mean, I totally agree with that. I have point on that, but just for people who maybe don't get it, the importance of privacy and why it's important now. Because for many people, okay, that's a human right, I need that, I'm value my privacy, but they don't feel urgency.
Yeah. I think there's urgency coming from a bunch of places, right? I think if we kind of look culturally, especially within the European context, after the Snowden revelations, after kind of WikiLeaks had its real moment, there was a lot. I suppose what I'm trying to say is there's urgency coming from a bunch of different directions, right? But they're all kind of they're all meeting in the middle at the moment, and this kind of perma crisis kind of way that we're also seeing in around the world in general, right? But I think generally, the world is becoming a lot less stable. We are generally seeing, there's all the stuff that a lot of people can probably speak more eloquently than me about, in terms of kind of the rise of increasingly knee-jerk or popularist politics and all of this kind of stuff as a response to the kind of perma crisis that we're seeing from the environment and everything else. But there was the urgency originally in terms of okay, we know that, the Snowden revelation showed that governments are both able to do this and willing to do this, and doing it in a way where they put a smiley face on a slide to show, encryption taken away and added here, right? The brazenness of literally having a smiley face on a slide, which is just mental. And I think the urgency is also coming from the fact that, like, you know, if you think about like what was possible computationally in terms of surveillance, like even a decade ago, now it's just so much more possible to both actually surveil, you know, capture enormous swathes of the internet and actually surveil it. Not only that, it's also now increasingly like a, you know, the domain of private companies that are doing this as well. So, you know, like however much of the world like runs on Amazon Web Services, you have within technology itself and the kind of infrastructures that we're using, you've also seen this kind of like, so massively centralized at this point that there's like single pots that are of actors who both have the means and the justification in their own kind of logic, which ultimately is the logic of money, right? Like to actually enact this kind of surveillance as well. And then the third, you know, addition to this clusterfuck is AI as well, right? Like this kind of the way that people are accepting AI and treating it as like a friend in their pocket, or even sometimes, you know, these like a god almost, right? And just pouring so many aspects of their lives into it, shows that people are kind of, I think, very like willing to actually engage with it. And the logic of AI is just completely data hungry, right? It's this kind of endless pit that if you just add more data to it, we can, you know, supposedly like pull finer and finer like granularity out of like whatever this, you know, massive haystack is that you've captured. Some people are also worried about quantum computing. I think there's like there's an element there that I think it's good to, you know, protect against, because we are in this situation where like it is feasible for people to, you know, save it now and decrypt it later, and you never know what's going to happen in 10 years and all of this kind of stuff. But I think the real urgency at the moment is coming from, this kind of this kind of real meeting in the middle of a couple of vectors, some of which are government surveillance that then basically got farmed out to private companies, and then now is justified through the market of AI, basically, and like the kind of data hungriness of it.
Yeah. Totally agree. And I would like to speak a bit more maybe about AI, because it's a really, really big thing now, and so many people are using that. So maybe have like your own like tips and tricks, look, because it's really hard not to use it sometimes, right? And it can be quite useful, but then like, how do you do that so that you are not doxing yourself too much? Like, are there any tips and tricks or restrictions or like tools or, I don't know, extra measures you can take so that you can use it, but still kind of be safe?
I mean, it's kind of like any tool, right? I think like I suppose the maybe like, the kind of the structural approach to essentially like compartmentalizing parts of your online life, right? Like also it's exactly the same as like how you run stuff on your computer, like how you run stuff on your phone in particular. Like phones are also like a very under-discussed like element of privacy, I think, or like the kind of the conversation surrounding privacy. Just because that, you know, that's kind of an almost oligopolistic kind of market. But I think there's I think it's kind of a question of like how much partitioning of what you do and how you do it online is something that you're kind of like willing to accept and it doesn't disrupt your life too much, right? It's like finding that balance between, you know, there's obviously like the kind of the old cypherpunk idea of like, you know, you like still have a flip phone and can only be, you know, communicated with via, you know, like a dead drop and all this stuff, but like it's simply like impractical, right? Yeah. Like the real question is like, exactly. It's like, how do you like actually live your life to the extent that you are like living a very, very full life whilst protecting yourself in the ways that you can? With regards to like AI tools, then it's like, you know, if you can, then, you know, there's stuff like Ollama, like you can now run DeepSeek locally and just chat with that. You're obviously not sending telemetry anywhere. Like Ollama does make it like really easy to do that, which is really nice. Otherwise, you know, there's just practical stuff like maybe don't ask maybe don't ask something that will essentially consistently affirm yourself and give you like a probabilistic kind of median response. Don't ask it personal questions about your life. You know, like it's if you want to use it for, I don't know. There's only so much that maybe you dox yourself by vibe coding tools rather than kind of allowing it into other aspects of your life. And I think that kind of applies for all of your tools, you know, like, like I run Graphene OS on my phone, for instance, but you still like have to have WhatsApp because I otherwise can't like easily communicate with my family, you know?
Yeah.
And like, so, okay, yeah, I still have it on my phone, but like it's partitioned and that's like an acceptable thing that I'm like willing to have at the moment, right? But also I don't think there's kind of, definitely not at the moment, and I'm not sure whether it like ever can be like an evergreen stack, you know, almost. I don't think there's this particular point that you get to where you're like, I'm now protected, I'm now private, you know, like your life changes, what you need changes, and what you're doing changes as well. You know, if you are like moving into a position where you're, I don't know, engaging in more activism and stuff, then you obviously have to like modify kind of like what you're doing. And also, unfortunately, also like be aware of the cat and mouse game that consistently is going on, you know, like the kind of the ability for de-anonymization is an arms race that runs hand in hand with the ability to like evade surveillance and censorship. So yeah, I think it's unfortunately the answer is you kind of always have to be like slightly on top of what's going on. There's no like silver bullet, I don't think.
Yeah, it's 100%. It's always about the right balance, and it's about your needs, because we get so many questions on like what tool to use, what is private, what is secure, but then it's so personal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Assange has like one sort of stack. Like if you're getting your crypto salary, it's totally different.
Yeah.
And you don't need this, like overcomplicate your life. So you don't have to be maxi, you don't have to be all like down under the radar. Sometimes you just need some basic things to have. And then, you're running Graphene, but what's up?
Yeah.
That's life. And that's like avoid it. So
exactly, like looking at the personal stack of someone who is also known versus just in general, like how you know, kind of claw back and retain some privacy and whatever you're doing is like, I don't know, there's a kind of I think the way that we think about surveillance also in terms of the justifications for the people who are surveilling is also something to like really, really pay attention to. You know, like we've seen this over time where even with NIM, like the way that we talk about NIM is kind of or rather like the way the surveillance has been happening, right, has moved from governments doing it to now private companies doing it so that they can sell data sets, right? And they will obviously then like, and you know, data brokerage is like, as an industry is enormous. And the pool of actors and what they're trying to capture and why they're trying to capture it has only grown. But then you also have to think of, exactly, like, are you kind of already singled out as a person? Are you, or like maybe you, exactly, like if you're engaging in like direct activism and all of this kind of stuff, then like, you need to have like a far more stringent stack, obviously. But in terms of just day-to-day, like engaging with tools that like evade surveillance, you know, you're also, are you able to throw a bit of sand into the cogs of like the larger machines that are able to do it? And it's not just kind of about evading direct surveillance. It's also like, you know, if you get a large enough mass of people using anonymity technologies, like looking at the kind of the slow kind of, or like maybe like more like, widespread power that's able to kind of like push back against these kind of forces, right?
By the way, let's talk a bit about NIM.
Yes.
Maybe some people just don't know. I mean, heard, maybe they have spoken. Just explain a bit, like on the top layer, like what's NIM, and then a bit more in details, like what application and network layers, like how does it work.
Yeah, sure.
just a brief introduction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, so NIM as a project, we are essentially focused on network level privacy. So, and by that, think of like Tor and I2P and all of these kind of stuff. NIM itself is, we call it a noise generating mixnet. What we kind of mean by that is there are two kind of ways to be, or like, I don't know, I suppose like surveillance can kind of happen on like multiple levels, right? It can happen almost on the application level. And you could think about that in terms of, okay, can WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, like what could they, if their infrastructure was so inclined or subverted, what would they be able to do? Would they be able to read my messages, for instance, right? And you can think of that as like the data of what you're sending around, like the contents of your messages. But surveillance at this point has become so fine-tuned that you can actually you can build up very complex and detailed models of people based really on like metadata. So data about data in the context of sending a message, right? I'm sending you a message, even if whoever is kind of like surveilling the network at this point can't necessarily read the contents of the message that I'm sending it to you, then you can still, if you're kind of just sending it over the internet in a kind of an unprotected way, you can still see the IP address, therefore the location of where I am, where you are, the time that we're sending it. You can infer a lot of that from the time. Like if we, one of the examples that Claudia Diaz, who's a chief scientist on the team, she has this great example of like, well, if you're only sending someone messages, very late at night / early in the morning on the weekend, what can you infer about the relationship of those two people? Like as I think like a really like easy to kind of access example. But also even on the level of like, from just looking at packets of data move through the internet, you can make reasonably good assumptions about what kind of data is in there, and okay, like, oh, right, okay, you're always sending emails to this particular IP address at a particular time. Like that's kind of interesting stuff. So it's like this, and we're like really looking at like protecting your metadata from being surveilled. The way that we do that is you basically have all of your traffic is encrypted, like multiply encrypted, so kind of in the same way as Tor, and it goes through 5 hops. All of your data is also broken up into these Sphinx packets, right, which is the encryption format that we use. Those are all routed like individually through the network. So like one of the main differences with Tor, you create a circuit of 3 servers, and then you kind of stream all of your traffic through it. Instead, I would like break up my message. Let's say we break it up into 10 packets. They're all sent through different routes through the mixnet infrastructure, which is this kind of decentralized network run by various other operators. We don't run any of it ourselves. And so from that perspective, it's like, okay, cool. All the packets are exactly the same size and they're all encrypted in exactly the same format. You've already removed the ability to look at the traffic and kind of start gaining a fingerprint of like what kind of traffic is going through it, right? And then another thing you have to do to protect it from surveillance is you also have to protect against timing-based attacks. So if you look at kind of, you can see all of this traffic maybe like moving in and out of a network. If you can see packets going in and then packets coming out, it doesn't matter if you can't see what's happening inside the network. If you can just watch the edges, then you can start to gain, you can start to infer like, okay, cool. So it probably like the stuff that kind of went in there then probably came out there then. They're talking to them, So what you need to be able to protect against is this kind of timing-based analysis. And the way that you do that is kind of twofold. One, whenever you're connected, you're sending what we call cover traffic in there, which is basically just empty Sphinx packets, right? So you're sending these like loops of cover traffic through the network, and you're always doing that. So your client is always sending it at like a consistent rate, right? This kind of heartbeat of traffic. So all traffic is moving through, coming from your client, like this set tempo. And whenever you do have data to actually be sent through the network to another person, then you just slot those packets in, really. So then, and as it moves through the network, it's called a mixnet, and mixing is what happens, right? So every time a node will like take a packet, a mix node will take a packet, you can think of it like a deck of cards being shuffled. So you basically, I'm a mix node, I'm getting packets from everywhere. I'll hold them for like a variable amount of time. So you add this element of randomness, you kind of add this kind of entropy into the system, and then I will send them out in a different order that I get them. So then now you have, okay, everything's the same size, everything looks the same. You can't tell what's covered traffic and what's not. The rate is constant, and you have this time-based mixing, right? So then if you're trying to observe this, even if you're kind of laser focused on, okay, I'm going to watch all the traffic moving in and out of this one mix node, there's no way really of identifying which packets, as soon as they go into it, you can't tell which packet is the one that maybe you were trying to track because it, might have been held longer. It's not first in, first out, basically. There's two kind of ways to use the mixnet at the moment. So we have, the mixnet, the noise generating mixnet is that's a decentralized network that's there, and that's meant to be kind of, you can think of it as a, privacy as a public good, right? But obviously we want people to be building on top of this and using it. And so we've built the first product that's kind of using the network, which is NymVPN, which has two modes. It has the slightly slower mode.
Like one remark before we go to VPN, which is kind of cool. Just one remark for the viewers, because you explained perfectly like how your mixnet works, but I also like how you have it on your presentations and on your website. You have a really nice animation.
Yes.
It gets going and then up. And like if you got confused but some point, like how does it work, just go to the Nym website. You will see that it's very brilliant animation and it's super self-explanatory.
Yep.
So just into VPN. So this is pretty cool that you have this both network and application layer in Nym.
Yeah. So this is so the NymVPN product is there's kind of two ways of using it. You can either use the full mixnet mode, right, where you're kind of fragmenting your data into all of these packets that sent through the network. However, and this is where kind of like the reality of protecting against surveillance kind of hits people's needs, right? A lot of the time the mixnet or mixnets in general, right, are like, they're suitable for kind of these asynchronous actions that we do a lot of, right? For stuff like chats, for stuff like sending crypto transactions, something like this, where the extra second or two of latency isn't really either it's not a problem or it's just something that you're like willing to accept, right? In a lot of cases, I think with, asynchronous stuff like chats, you don't ever really notice. So there's no, you're never really in a chat where like every single second is, fundamental to the experience. But for a lot of stuff, web browsing, calls, especially like streaming video, stuff like this, then like it's a bit too slow. So there's another, the kind of the speedier mode, right, that the VPN has is basically like a 2-hop instead of a 5-hop. And so it's like a tunnel in a tunnel. And basically that's still using some of the nodes in the network, but it's ignoring the mixed nodes. So you're just kind of using what we call gateways. So like your kind of entry and exit to the mixnet. And basically what that is it's a WireGuard tunnel inside another WireGuard tunnel. So you're still able to kind of disintermediate sender and receiver, right? So you still have a lot of the protections. You're not kind of like leaking your IP. Neither side of this, neither gateway has like a full idea of what you're doing, right? But it's not got like the full protections of the mixnet. And I think one of the things that I think is like useful to think about in terms of privacy stuff when we're kind of like talking more broadly about this, right? There's privacy in the immediate sense, which is like, I don't want anyone to know that I'm sending you a message. But then, and especially with regards to this kind of like surveillance based on like kind of massive data sets being kind of crunched using machine learning, and these these inferences and these kind of relationship between nodes in the data set being like built up, that's based on the fact that different actions are linkable, right? So like unlinkability, the idea of being able to, even if you can see, okay, cool, there's like 100 crypto transactions that are kind of coming through and going to this RPC endpoint. The idea of unlinkability is to not be able to say, okay, cool, well, we can basically infer that like 50 people have used it twice, or there's 10 people who really like using this RPC endpoint. The idea is to break the ability to link any two actions over time, right? So that's the more kind of extended like temporal move, right? And breaking the ability to like infer relationships based on a series of actions rather than just protect a single one. And I think that's maybe an idea that's not discussed as broadly, or like not as much within our the kind of like conversations about privacy more generally.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining Nim what you do. It's a great job that you do, basically.
Thank you.
And a huge thank you for that. You're like a really important player, I think, in the whole privacy ecosystem. But I want to jump a bit to more like a cultural layer in privacy, because I mean, you have your artistic background, like music and activism and things, and I think that it's super nice and it's super cool to have more people from like, I don't know, artistic community or music community or activist community, which are often kind of like aside just because it's very technical, everything around privacy, because we have a lot of crazy tech.
Yeah.
And it's really, I mean, I don't understand the key, and I said it like really easy because like, I will never be able to do that.
Yeah.
I understand like on the level and like how people with PhD in math understand that, I would never do that.
Yeah.
Of course, I understand like basic things.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I will never understand it like that deep. So, my point is like, I'm happy always to see people with some sort of like artistic background or some artistic expressions, because I think like privacy and what we are kind of advocating for is like more about the culture, right? It's more, it's less about like building tech, but also like the way you behave, like your like kind of life choices every day. Like, what apps do you use? Like, what habits do you have? And that's, I think that's about it. So maybe there is something practical you can recommend for someone who wants to be more private, but just like in the beginning of this way, like some simple tools or practices or habits or resources, just to like how to act, as well.
Yeah, I think I would say the main way is probably, don't think that you have to like immediately make your entire stack private, like at the same time, otherwise you failed, right? A lot of this stuff is very complicated, and the kind of like daily practices, if you're trying to stay like completely anonymous, like are very difficult, impossible for most people, and otherwise like pretty undesirable for the majority of people, right? I think there's always kind of, there's kind of like I think there's the advocacy side of this conversation, which is like, like try and get your family to like use Signal instead of WhatsApp or something like this, which is like, it's a valuable point, but like maybe sometimes you just can't do it. But really it's kind of how much do you kind of split apart different aspects, kind of like silo different bits of how you interact online, in a way that is like workable for you, like maybe don't just always be like perma logged into Google and use Google for everything. You can use email addresses for logging in, even though it's a million times easier to go, oh yeah, cool, I'll just log in with Google, or even just be logged in with Google in your browser. Increasingly, like there's a lot of tools where, if you're using Firefox, switch to like try out LibreWolf, or, even like plugins for different user agents for different stuff. You can say, okay, well, like I'll have like a user agent for work, or maybe I'll use a particular browser for like all of my work stuff. Maybe I'll use one for like all my personal stuff. Applications like Proton Mail have increasingly, they have this, these like, oh, you can make like one-shot email addresses, which are, you need to sign up for Amazon, but you don't want to like log in with your main email address on Amazon all the time and like have this kind of linkability between like, oh, okay, cool. So they have an Amazon account, they have this, they have that, like, right? There's like, and kind of exploring some of these things which are kind of like browser plugins or tools or alternate versions of existing applications as well. And I don't know, I think like try and have fun with it as well. Like it is ultimately like,
we need more fun in this
industry, like,
please.
And like a lot of the vibe of a lot of privacy stuff is very, you can't scare people into using privacy stuff. Like in terms of, if we're speaking about trying to get, hundreds of thousands, millions of people kind of like using the kind of tools we're talking about, right? You can't have privacy as being this idea of like, you're kind of scared and you're scared of the light, you're kind of hiding in the dark, you're kind of separating yourself away, this kind of, the idea of the lone hacker, right? Like, which I don't think was ever necessarily true even, but like this, the cultural idea of it, really it needs to like, you need to kind of think of it as like this, as the ability to create like a generative space, right, for people to be free in. Even in the sense of like, I don't know, you're kind of like, clubs are a very good example of this, right? Clubs that put stickers over phone cameras so people can not be self-correcting or like aware of themselves in a way where you're possibly always like in public, or there's the capacity for you to always be in public and, maybe be in the background of a video or like whatever, right? And I think like thinking about it in that way, where maybe a club does that so people can feel as free and be as like as genuine an expression of themselves as they want, as they can, is a really good way to think about this. Like what kind of spaces are you either like re-enabling, or are you enabling in the creation of these spaces that are, that allow people to relax ultimately, like, and relax into a space and like fully inhabit a space and be free within it. And yeah, like privacy stuff can also be fun, just because, like having, I don't know, I think so I really like disappearing messages on Signal, and I partially really like them, like obviously, yes, the privacy aspect of it, fantastic, but it almost feels like it's quite weird to be having, you could have like really personal conversations over something like Signal, but then for that to just exist, like kind of in perpetuity on two people's phones is actually quite strange. You know what I mean? Like it's and sometimes that's fantastic, having this like record of conversations and stuff, but actually like just looking at something like disappearing messages, it almost feels like a more organic, like it feels more like talking, where unless you are literally recording an interview like this or something, then like you will remember a conversation that you had, but you won't like literally have the evidence of it all of the time. And it almost feels more like chatting in the fact that you don't have this like perma archive of everything that you've ever written, and little things like that I think are quite fun ways to get into it. Like if you're like, if you're like nerdily inclined, like, playing with like PGP emails is quite fun. But also it's kind of fun partially because it's kind of difficult and a bit janky, sorry, that was a very like rambling kind of response to that.
Fine. But we are just having a free flow, right?
Yeah.
It's not about like answering directly.
Yeah.
It's more about sharing.
Yeah.
So it's super valuable anyway.
Yeah. And I think it's also, having this, being able to get people into the privacy space as well through the culture of, or like trying to create a culture that's open and, accepting to more people that maybe like look at it and go, oh, well, I'm not very techie, so I can't really like contribute to this, is a massive thing. And I mean, like, that's something that like you guys with Web3 Privacy now are doing like very well and like kind of, you know,
Thank you.
really bringing to the space. Because yeah, like if you only build stuff for techie people, then you will only get techie people using it. Whereas really like what you need to think about, and especially in the context of like the kind of, you know, the real kind of like backpedaling the government seem to be doing on stuff like LGBTQA rights and, you know, kind of like gender rights more generally, the ability for the right to protest as well, like what counts as organizing, all of this kind of stuff is really, really being like re-encroached upon in places that maybe over the last couple of years there've been wins. And it's less about kind of defending from a particular thing and more about like, okay, like what kind of conversations and spaces and experiences for people, and therefore conversations and like plans can come out of, oh, okay, well, we kind of are able to have this very free political conversation in the context of like, even, I don't know, like a, you know, like a group at school or like a, you know, like a queer space or something. And it's like, okay, well, we know that like the conversation that's being had here is also maybe happening online, signal chat, stuff like this is free from surveillance, so we can be more free. I think especially given like the pace that everything is just happening at the moment, you know, this kind of, and the ability, the fact that we do because of, you know, Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, like all of this kind of stuff, there is this like permanent stream of, you know, kind of information that's almost like cattle prodding you through the kind of, you know, the several simultaneous crises that are happening at any one point, or, you know, the infringement of civil rights across the world, that you kind of even just need these spaces within which you can actually relax and then like start taking the long view on things, you know, and planning properly, I think. And yeah, that's really the kind of like generative space, free from the potential of surveillance and this kind of self-policing that I think this kind of stuff enables, and we need to really like focus on bringing about. Yeah.
What do you think? Is there any chance for like us to like spread our bubble a bit and like make people more self-aware and aware about like what's going on and like how they actually can balance themselves and restrict themselves with their like inner boundaries? So is there a chance like to move it forward?
Yeah, and I think culture in all its forms has always kind of been doing this, right? Like from like, you know, art and literature to like especially the spaces of clubbing, like music spaces. Mm-hmm. You know, one of my like initial interests in noise music was partially because I'm not like properly trained as a musician. Like I was always kind of like semi self-taught and was unable to do a lot of stuff. And, you know, there's a way where you can feel frustrated by that, but then you kind of find this world of, oh, okay, you can kind of like really break out of like whatever, you know, supposed norms that you thought of as a musician being there, and like find other ways to express yourself, like in this case, sonically, right? And that was immensely freeing. And I think really it's like that's culture is the necessary vehicle for that, right? And I think it's, even though it's, unfortunately, it's also like adds an entire other level of complexity to everything, right? But, you know, allowing people to like have those like moments of, oh, wow, you know, that was really cool. Another thing is possible is the thing that's the vehicle, you know? Yeah. And I haven't really been like focused on art so much in the last couple of years. I've been focused on Nym, but like that's always very, very much there. And I think if you know, look at the intermingling between the kind of like, you know, hacktivist scenes, the kind of art scenes, and maybe like, you know, the kind of like people that came out of like the alter globalization movement, stuff like this, or I don't know, even, you know, you look at an anarchist zine and you can tell that this thing was like made by a person, and it was like made because someone gives a shit about it, and it was made with love, and like you immediately understand that on a human level. And I think it's also kind of like imbuing what you're trying to do with that, is which is a very like amorphous thing, but it's also kind of beautifully amorphous as well, because everyone can approach it in their own way, you know. And it's kind of, I think but at the same time also like kind of meeting people where they're at and starting to guide people, rather than, you know, being like, oh, you, I don't know, use an iPhone and you're on Instagram, so like you're obviously not, you know, part of the like the scene, you know, like that's pointless and doesn't actually lead to anything. It's like, I think in a certain way you can also like almost think of like a lot of the like the mentality of surveillance, right? The mentality of surveillance is the ability to like, which is kind of, you know, you could also link it to kind of like fascistic impulses as well, right? It's the partitioning and categorization of people and behavior into like neat little boxes, and decomplexifying everything to be able to fit it into those little boxes. And really, like, I don't know, what we almost need to do is like we need to re-complexify and blur the boundaries of stuff. The positive aspect of that, like, is like that's a generative thing that humans kind of always do, and like people can find a lot of meaning in doing that. But then at the same time, you also make it like harder for the categorizers to categorize, you know? Something that like more broadly, I suppose, as like a space that like the crypto space maybe doesn't do enough is, which is also endemic in the technology like kind of like industry more generally, right, is the idea of like always inventing something new. Whereas actually, you know, you can look at like a lot of like political history as well, right? Like learning about how people in different contexts, what like acts of resistance they were able to take. And also through art, right? Like look at the Situationists or people like this. There was kind of this, this ability to kind of like, to both make culture political, but then use culture politically as well. And there's so much there, you know, like there is a vast amount of learning about how people have previously engaged both in like acts of resistance, but also acts of solidarity. I think is also really important. And there's a lot that can be drawn from that. Like even, you know, I don't know, I mean, looking at maybe like the model of like democratic confederalism that like the people in Rojava are kind of have built and are maintaining in the face of massive amounts of imperial power. The fact that the Zapatistas are still very much operating and maintaining like an enormous like part of Mexico. The movements in Myanmar, which are like drawing from that. These are all movements that like are learning about and drawing from each other. And I think there's almost a tendency as well internally within like privacy tech maybe, or just kind of like tech in general, for not reading into that as much as possible. Because I think ultimately, like if you kind of see privacy as the endpoint, in the same way that like kind of decentralization maxis, right? Like it's Jamie Lewis has this fantastic point, which is like what you should be decentralizing is power, right? Like you always have to think about what we're doing like within the context of power, I think, and like what you're trying to do with that. Seeing privacy tech as just like the end goal in itself, I don't find particularly interesting, but I don't think it gives us anything. It doesn't like generate anything. It's more, okay, we need to build these tools, but like, what are you going to use the tools for? What do the tools like enable you to do? What like new areas of autonomy from something, from governments, like cultural autonomy, like what are you actually trying to do with that and why? And I think also then being able to have that as like a guiding North Star is also that's the thing that like energetically drives you, right? Like that's like a really like vitalizing thing as well. And it's very easy especially when you think about this all the time, like obviously thinking about like how easy it is to surveil networks and build up like behavioral models of people all the time sometimes bums me out, or like sometimes I'm like thinking about this, I'm like, oh, I still am using WhatsApp though. Like, oh, this feels dirty, but like you can also use it as a way to like, to revitalize yourself and what you're doing and the people around you, right? And kind of like work out ways that we can collectively lift each other up in the face of all of the, like, quite frankly, insane shit that's going on at the moment that doesn't show any real sign of like alleviating or not just ramping up another level. Like it's a pretty dark, fucked up time at the moment. And I think because of that, like you have to think about what you're doing tactically and like, are you just building something in isolation, or are you building something that's actually going to do something to help actual people? I think is that's like the main driver of like why I do what I do. And I think it is, the same can be said for like a lot of people in this space, right? It's like the amount of not just stuff that I've learned, but like people, experiences, and worldviews that I've met in this space is also just like is staggering and really quite beautiful, So yeah.
Yeah, so the one of the big things that unites us all, I think, is like some sort of disappointment in like what's going on globally, and that we are trying actively to do something, because it's nice to have agency, right?
Yeah.
Times, and especially when the things that are happening that are so big, they are so huge, and they're often guided by such a big and powerful entities. It's very easy to kind of see it and, okay, I can do anything.
Yeah.
Right. But still, there are so many people in the space who are doing stuff and it feels that slowly it's kind of moving. So I wanted you to reflect a bit on like future. Imagine we are like 30 years ahead. Privacy got bigger, the internet is private, it's secure, it's the way we want to be. It is like a permanent internet future. How it would look like how life might look like, this happy, beautiful times. We are in the paradise, like private paradise.
I would hope that, I would hope that everything is so lush and complex that almost like you could almost that you can't predict it, right? Because there's just so much there. Like, and I don't know, I'm kind of that, although that does kind of slightly seem like a cop out of an answer, the justification that I basically have for that, right? Which is also me, like wanting to rep a podcast that I really, really rate. There's also a real like, kind of a thing that can also give you hope, right? When you're like, oh my God, I'm feeling really down. Because exactly like the small groups working against these like, especially like structural kind of, the structures of whatever, of capitalism, of authoritarian, and all of this, right? Like this isn't a new problem, right? And there's people, especially in like anarchist and leftist politics, have been operating and, like engaged with these kind of structural forces for, just, the entire length of contemporary history, right? So there's an absolutely fantastic podcast called Cool People Who Do Cool Stuff, which is done by Margaret Killjoy. And it's kind of one of the things that I really love about that, but then, ostensibly it's a history podcast, right? That is focusing on cool people who did cool stuff. But like the real thing that I'm trying to bring out of that for this conversation is the idea that like you also can't necessarily always predict what seem like really small actions, what they actually do and the ripple effects of that. Like, what are the actual effects of like, I don't know, food not bombs or something like this, right? That, that's kind of like touched a lot of people's lives in an incredibly profound way, in a way that you just simply like can't generally also know, but you also know that you're like doing something positive. And I think, we should also be able to like focus on the acts that we're able to do in the face of these structural forces, because you don't necessarily know the ripple effects of all of this kind of stuff. With regard to like, what the privacy future looks like, ideally the AI industry no longer exists because it has become economically unviable to build stuff based off like dragnetting the entire internet for everyone's personal data. There's realistically, I think also like, you're kind of this this re-complexifying of life, I think, is the main thing. The kind of the encroachment on for instance, like, trans rights, queer rights, like LGBTQIA rights is like really, that's endemic of this thing that we talked about before, right? This increased categorization of like, okay, people are like this or like this or like this, and that's it. And anything outside of that is like wildly dangerous. So yeah, hopefully this is the kind of like post-privacy has one world is lush, vibrant, and incredibly complex, and on kind of like all kind of like social levels. And I think from that, hopefully also far more like cooperativist as well. I think one of the things that would also be really good to like kind of like bring into the space is the idea of like not just building tools for other people, but also building tools in collective ways. Obviously, a lot of people building in the space are doing it using the company form and having money from VCs and all of this kind of stuff, which is partially by necessity, right? You have to like, people need to pay rent and eat and, have families and all of this kind of stuff. But hopefully we could also move to like far more towards like cooperative structures of building stuff away from this kind of company mentality. That would also be something that I would, hope to see in this like new world. Yeah.
Okay, so let's hope it's gonna happen. So
yeah,
what I can say.
Well, we have to build it, right? We have to build it. We have to build cooperative structures that are also built in like a meaningful way, right? There's been like a bit of chatter at the moment. Like I think Vitalik said this at ETH Dublin, where he was like, the DAO model that we assumed and that everyone talked about for so long seems like it's broken. It seems like the initial assumptions that we basically made about that would seem to be incorrect, right? And maybe we need to kind of start it again. Like I think there are tools for autonomy shouldn't be just for if the tools for autonomy are only really used and built for individual autonomy, then we've kind of lost, right? Or we've like kind of lost sight of, I think, what we're trying to do. It's like you need to be able to create tools that allow people to have more agency, but also then like for groups, not just for themselves, individual liberation kind of isn't really a thing because nothing exists in a silo, even though we're like, it's so used to thinking of ourselves as this, the atomized individual or like the economic individual or something like this. Like it's a conception of the world that I think is like ultimately very damaging. And yeah, re-engaging in like the ability to think of ourselves collectively as well, and what you want to do and who you want to do that with and why is, I think one of the stepping stones to hopefully like building this new world. And yeah,
this is beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we're done.
Yeah.
Nice. How do you feel?
Good. Yeah.
Bravo.
Yeah. Thanks, man.
It was like wow conversation.
Oh yeah, no, it's like it's I think it's actually quite interesting. Like everyone seems like they're going like really fucking mask off at the moment.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think we have to. It's just like, what are you doing and why are you building this? And are you like doing something that is actively helping people or not? It seems to be the sentiment that is floating around, and it's a sentiment that like I'm finding very energizing, which I think might have come off. Yeah.
And times are quite harsh, and it's really important that we are here and we try to kind of do something and build something. I hope eventually it will help someone and something.
Fingers crossed. Yeah.